Today's game features Mikhail Tal playing as white against Lautier as black. Move 1. White advances to d4. Black knight jumps to f6. White plays repositions the knight to f3. Black pushes to e6, a principled move, fighting for the center. Move 5. White expands on the side. Equal chances for both sides. Black advances to b5. White brings out the dark squared bishop. Black now plays bishop to b7. Following the opening principles, white chooses kingside castling. Black pushes to c5. White plants the bishop on g5. A complex position. Black continues with repositions the queen to b6. So, pawn to a4, activity on the queenside. Black expands on the side. The position is unclear. We're at move 15. White develops the knight to c3. It's black's turn. Places the knight on e4. Maintaining flexibility. At this point, white knight captures the knight on e4. Meanwhile, bishop takes knight on e4. White pawn takes the pawn. Black queen eliminates the pawn. Continuing, activates the queen, creating complications. Black continues with pawn moves to f6. White now plays bishop slides to f4, creating a bind. Next, activates the queen. Move 25. White pushes the pawn to c4. The evaluation changes here. Now, black pawn captures the pawn on d4. Meanwhile, queen eliminates the pawn. Meanwhile, advances to e5, that doesn't look right. White bishop snaps off the pawn. Black pawn takes bishop, winning material. White queen snaps off the pawn, with a powerful check, creating attacking chances. Black bishop moves to e7. White reroutes the knight to d4. Not the best move. Black bishop captures bishop, preparing the final assault. We're at move 35. White knight jumps to f5. Black responds with activates the queen. White king takes bishop. Black improves the knight's position. White queen captures pawn, offering material. Black castles on the queenside. White rook snaps off the pawn. Black plays brings out the queen to b7, pushing for the win. White brings the rook to a1. Interestingly, knight hops to b4. And that's check. A questionable choice. Move 45. White activates the king. Black knight captures rook. White queen takes bishop, a sacrifice, shouldering the king away. Interestingly, activates the queen in the endgame. It's white's turn. Deploys the queen to a3. Black rook to f8. The win is within reach. White responds with develops the knight to d6, discovering check. Black king walks to c7. White responds with queen takes knight, a sacrifice, creating zugzwang threats. At this point, black rook shifts to a8. Move 55. White queen takes queen. With check, black king captures the queen on b6. White moves the rook to d1, demonstrating perfect technique. Black rook shifts to a2. White repositions the rook. It's black's turn. Moves the king. White advances the pawn, marching the pawn forward. Black continues with brings the rook to a8. Meanwhile, white maneuvers the knight to b5. So, black activates the rook in the endgame. Move 65. White brings the rook to c2, a questionable choice. Black brings the king forward, a questionable choice. White knight hops to c3. So, black slides the rook to a1, giving check. White moves the king. At this point, rook takes pawn on c4. So, cuts off the enemy king with the rook. An error in judgment. Meanwhile, slides the rook to a7. White advances the pawn to e4. Black activates the king. We're at move 75. White king enters the battle. Black now plays rook moves behind the passed pawn. White slides the rook to c2. Black pushes the pawn to d6. White king to d3. It's black's turn. Rook shifts to c5, restricting the opponent's pieces. White pawn to f4. Black moves the rook to b4. White advances the pawn. Continuing, black the king becomes active. Move 85. White pushes to g5. Black plays king marches up the board. White advances to h4, missing the best continuation. Black advances the pawn. That doesn't look right. White boldly takes pawn with the knight. Black rook exchanges into the endgame. The technique is impeccable. White knight takes rook on b4. Meanwhile, black rook removes the pawn. White develops the knight to c2. Black slides the rook to b3. Checking the king. Move 95. White king moves to c4, a mistake. Black moves the rook to h3. White knight hops to d4. And that's check. Black king moves to f7, improving piece activity in the endgame. White continues with pawn moves to f5. Black rook takes pawn on h4. Interestingly, white king moves to d5, showing excellent endgame understanding. Black rook swings to g4, converting with precision. White brings the knight to f3. Black activates the rook in the endgame, a questionable choice. We're at move 105. White develops the knight to e5, and check. A forcing move. Black steps the king to g8. White continues with pushes to f6. Black responds with rook removes the pawn, an error in judgment. And here, centralizes the king, trading into a winning endgame. Black rook moves behind the passed pawn. Moving forward, white pushes forward to f7. And that's check. Black responds with king enters the battle. White knight hops to d7. This simplification helps. Black now plays rook shifts to f1. On move 115, white pushes the pawn to f8. Check. Black rook captures queen, moving closer to victory. White knight eliminates the rook. And here, black pawn to h6. It's white's turn. Knight hops to d7. Black advances the pawn. White continues with develops the knight to e5. It's black's turn. Advances the pawn to h4. White now plays knight to f3. Lautier resigns. Mikhail Tal wins the game.